Good morning, everyone. This cold Monday. Thanks for coming here. Today we have our colleague Christophe Pallier, who is the director of the language team at UNICOG. Christophe is a research director at CNRS, working mainly on language, using fMRI and behavioral methods also, and computational modeling. And today he'll talk about syntactic representations in the brain.
Thank you, Sophie. Can I speak without the mic? Yeah? Yeah. Maybe simpler. Okay, so for too many years, so I dare not say how many years, I've been interested in this question regarding language, which is right now when you are listening to me, your brain is receiving an acoustic wave in your ears, and your brain kind of transform it into thoughts. Hopefully you are trying to understand what I'm saying, and so there are processes going on in your brain that transform this acoustic wave into a message. The classic view from psycholinguistics is that there is a series of stages. First, the acoustic wave is transformed into speech categories, phonemes, syllables, whatever. Then the next stage is to recognize the words that form the speech stream. Then to identify the relationships between the words in the sentence. And this is called syntactic parsing, and this is what we are going to focus on today. And then from the words and the relationships between the words, you compute a meaning for the sentence, a kind of literal meaning. And finally, at the very last stage, you interpret the sentence, you interpret the meaning. So to give you an idea of the kind of very impressive capability that you have, if I tell you the omelette went without paying, this sentence may seem bizarre, but imagine that you are in a coffee. You can imagine one of the waiter telling another waiter that this happened. So taking into understanding language is not out of context. Usually we understand a given sentence in a context, and we make a lot of very complicated inferences. One day, probably I will be retired. I would have hoped to study this level, but it is super complicated. So today I'm mostly going to focus on the syntactic parsing and syntax aspect. And for this, I need to give you a crash course on syntax that might remind you the years in primary school where you had to identify the group verbal, group nominal, and so on. So if you take a given language, say French or English, obviously not any string of words is a possible sentence. Okay. Here I wrote a few examples. If I say le chien a le chat mordu, this is not a correct French sentence. If I say the dog has the cat bitten, it's not a correct English sentence. But if I translated it word by word into German, it would be a correct sentence in German. If I say quelle est la différence entre un pigeon, same thing, there's something odd about this sentence, it's missing something. If I say Verdet dorme incolore idée furieusement, this is also not a good French sentence. But if I say des idées vertes incolores dorment furieusement, as a French speaker, you have a feeling that maybe this is meaningless, but it's kind of acceptable from a grammatical point of view. Okay, I hope you share this intuition. This example is very famous and comes from Noam Chomsky book from the 50s. So what is a grammar? A grammar is an algorithm or a set of rules that generate or recognizes which strings of words are acceptable sentences in a language. Okay, which is not the same as meaningful sentences. If you say that des idées vertes incolores dorment furieusement is not, maybe not meaningful, but still it has a property of being grammatically acceptable for a French speaker. Now, in the 50s and 60s, linguists give themselves this task of trying to write a formal algorithm that would generate the possible sentences, say from English or from French or from German. Write a formal system, an algorithm like a computer program. Imagine yourself trying to write a program that will generate all possible sentences in English, correct sentences. The starting point, the idea was to use finite state transition automata like this one. So these are machines that go from one state to another with transitions. So you could describe a sentence in English as, for example, a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase. A noun phrase could either be, let's see in this grammar, it could be determiner noun, it could be just a pronoun like he or her, or she, sorry, or it could be a determiner with an adjective with loop. So you could have the big red car, for example, would be a NP. And a VP would be here in this tiny model, a verb followed by another NP. So you could generate the cat bites the dog, for example. The problem with that is that it doesn't work. If you look at this diagram in which you see the transition probabilities of the grammatical groups inside a sentence in English. So S means sentence, NP would be the subject of the sentence, noun phrase, and V would be the verb. You immediately see that it's not simply a pronoun, a determiner, a noun, and an adjective, but you can have embedded, even embedded sentences. Imagine you have a subjective thing. You say, the man that was beaten by the dog went outside. Okay, so the NP itself can contain a sentence. And this is, so if you try to draw a finite state automaton for English, it becomes fractal because of that property. So you can have sentences embedded in sentences and so on. Of course, humans, we have a limit on the size of sentences we can utter, but still theoretically, you just cannot use a finite state automaton to represent fractal things. Okay, so that was realized in the 50s. And at that time, especially Noam Chomsky proposed that you need to have an algorithm that goes beyond the finite states system, like I mentioned, and you need at least, and actually you need more, but you need at least context-free grammars. The difference between context-free grammar and finite automaton is small, but has lots of implications. The difference is that you can have recursive things in the grammar. So you can write things like that. Sentence is NPVP, just as before, but no NP, a noun phrase, groupe nominal en français, could be like before determinant noun, but it could be a determinant noun of an NP. The grandmother of Mary, the father of the grandmother of Mary. This is still a noun phrase, but you can increase it theoretically as long as you want. And it can even contain a sentence, that the example I gave before, the dog that was beaten by the man, blah, blah, blah. So you, with the fact of introducing recursions in the system, then you have a much more plausible model for the generation of sentences in a given language. And you can generate a set of sentences that looks much more like English than you could do with the limitation of finite state automaton. Don't worry, there are going to be brains soon. So what this automata or this algorithm provide are this kind of syntactic tree structures that, again, you might remember from your lectures in primary school. And these trees, they just represent the history of the application of the steps in the rule of the different rules. So you start from a sentence, and then the sentence becomes NP, VP, and you rewrite NP, for example, as a pronoun, and you rewrite VP as a VP plus a PP here. So that's where I wanted to give you this short introduction to tell you why trees and where do they come from. So they come from this application of rules, successive rules. And the important point about the trees is that they show that sentences are not pure linear sequences of words. They have mentally, they must have a structure, because the same string of words can have different interpretation depending on the syntax. So here I shot an elephant in my pajamas. The meaning of this sentence is that I was myself in my pajamas when I shoot the elephant, but this a string of words, I shoot an elephant in my pajamas, can also be in my pajamas, could mean that the elephant is wearing my pajamas, for example. So this is a famous sentence from Groucho Marx, who then asks, how did it get into my pajamas? I wonder. So you can see from that you can have the same string of words but different trees. And the idea of linguists is that in your mind you have the tree, you are forced to utter the sentence. It becomes a string that can be ambiguous. But internally, we don't work with sequences, we work with trees. That's the essential point. And there are many other arguments for the importance of syntactic trees. They allow to capture long distance dependencies between words in a sentence. So agreement between a subject and a verb, agreement in number in French. Les gens is plural. The verb here must be plural. On ne peut pas dire les gens qui prennent la voiture à tort. Okay, because there needs to be agreement. And to create these links between words within sentences, you cannot do it easily with finite state grammar. If you do it with finite state grammar, there's a limit on the number of middle items. If you use a context-free, there is no limit. So you can capture long-term dependencies. And we'll just give another example and not explain how it works, but in sentences, we can have pronouns or anaphors that refer to other words in the sentence. Okay? And as a child, you learn your language, French, English, and you learn unconsciously rules that tells you whether a pronoun can be linked to a word or not. So I give you this example from Chomsky again. Marie hurts, I forgot the S, hurts herself. Necessarily, herself has to be linked to Mary. We agree on that? But if I say Mary hurts her, her cannot be linked to Mary. Okay, that's a fact of English. No, if I say Mary's mother hurt herself, herself has to be linked to mother, can it be linked to Mary? Okay, and if I say Mary's mother hurt her, her has to be linked to Mary or somebody else, but certainly not to the mother. Okay, now after this lecture, if you want, you go back to your office and you try to write a program that explains how this works. And what linguists will tell you is that you need the trees. If you can easily express this kind of things with trees, you cannot explain it with linear structures. Okay, so that's one more argument for trees, and there are many like that. Okay, so these syntactic trees, they are formal objects created by linguists to describe regularities in languages, right? To say whether a sentence is acceptable in English or not. But even if before I said mentally they must be there, it's not so clear. Actually, some linguists will say this is just a formal device for us, but it doesn't have any psychological or neurological reality. So they are my own research program and that of other neurolinguists is to ask, do these objects, these trees, do they correspond to actual data structure in the mind brain of people? Okay. And are they, in my case for speech comprehension, are they really built in real time during speech comprehension? For example, some people have argued that you need them for production, but maybe you can understand language without computing the tree. Then if they are computed, are their brain areas specialized to build and represent these syntactic trees? Another question you can ask is there are other cognitive domains like mathematics, music, and so on, where you also have structures. Do we use the same brain areas to represent structures in music or in mathematics and in language? This is also a question of interest. And finally, if trees are represented in the brain, how are they represented by neural networks, actually? Okay, so today, unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about so much about the last 2 points. I will mostly present research asking question 2 and 3. So do we have syntactic trees in your brain, and are there specialized brain areas to represent them? So the very first experiment we ran on this question 15 years ago, I think, for those who remember, it was Anne-Dominique de Vauchel, PhD. We used a technique called syntactic priming. In psychology, priming means repeating some feature of a stimulus to see if it facilitates the processing at the second occurrence. Okay, so suppose you have to recognize faces of famous people. I show you pictures regularly on the screen. If I repeat the same photograph of the same person, the second time you are going to identify it faster because you've already done it. Okay, in your neural network, you have already activated the representation of this person. So we ask, can we find brain areas where repeating the same syntactic tree would show repetition suppression, that is less activity, which is typically what you observe in the brain when you repeat something. So we designed an experiment in which we presented sequences of sentences and sometimes 2 sequences in a row actually 4 sentences in a row, share the same syntactic structure, like the kid kicked the ball, a car hit the house. They have the same syntactic structure, or they could have different syntactic structure. The dog of my aunt died, a car hit the house. So it's always the same target, but it's either preceded by something that shares the tree or not. So more precisely, the experiment was like that. It was in French, but I translated it into English for English speakers. So we had people were in the scanner, either reading passively or listening to sentences in small blocks of 4. And we had condition A, B, and C. In condition A, the sentences were completely different words, different syntactic structure. In condition B, they had different words but share the same syntactic structure. And in condition C, we had sentences using the same words, but varying the syntactic structure. So things like an architect designed this palace. This palace was designed by an architect. So we go from active to passive and so on. So we reuse the same lexico-semantic content, but we change the syntactic structure. And we search for the brain areas where there is a difference between this condition, and more specifically, where there is less activation when you repeat the syntactic construction or the lexico-semantic content relative to the different sentences. Okay, you follow me? You understand the logic? And we were a bit disappointed because we didn't find any effect of repeating the syntactic tree, while we found clear effects of repetition inside the language network, in the mostly in the STS, supertemporal sulcus, when we add condition C. So C relative to A, there is a decrease of activation in the language network, but the same syntactic construction didn't seem to have any effect. So a posteriori, after you've done the experiment, you can find many potential explanations for the absence of a syntactic prime. One of them is that maybe syntactic trees are not computed. Okay. And you can even imagine when you write some syntactic parsers, you can do without ever computing the full syntactic tree. You do local syntactic computations, but you build a semantic representation and you don't need to keep all the details. So maybe the full syntactic tree is never computed in the brain. Maybe it's another possibility. Possibility 2 is that they are computed, but the way they are encoded in the neural networks of the brain would not lead to adaptation. Let's imagine that to have adaptation, you need to have exactly the same neurons activated twice. Okay. It could be that the link between words that you have in these trees are represented. I don't know. I say it's one hypothesis could be just synchronization between populations of neurons. And maybe you don't habituate synchronization. You can only habituate activation in neurons. So it could be that the method doesn't allow you to probe really this thing. And then one remark is that when you look at the literature around the same time, other people were working on this, and some of them in their studies reported some effect of syntactic priming. But there are many differences between their studies and us. First of all, they were often using production. And remember, I told you some people say you need syntax only for production, but not perception. And also they had a task, difficult task to perform on the sentence. And when you have a task, it could be that the fact that you have a complex task to do on the sentence encourages you to compute the syntactic tree. And that's what we are going to see later. Around the same time, so this was, and Dominique's PhD was 2009. In 2010, with a postdoc, Asaf Bashrash, for those who remember him, we wanted to run a decoding study. We said, one way to see if there are syntactic trees in the brain is just to present different types of trees and see if we can decode the tree from the activation pattern of the brain. This is also something we did with Bertrand Thirion and with Alex Renfort. And so we wanted to present different trees and the sentence to differ only on the trees and nothing else. Imagine I tell you, I saw a black taxi driver, or I saw a black taxi driver. Just by using pauses or kind of parentheses, I have different trees, right? So that's basically what we did in this experiment. We manipulate the prosody to create sentences of the type A or B and C or D, or A or B and C or D. So just by playing with poses, you can create different types of structure, believe me. So we recorded sentences of these types where A, B, and C were replaced by actual nouns of animals, food items, furniture, or colors. And in the scanner, people would listen to these sentences. For example, the cow and the dog or the rabbit or the hen, and they had to check whether this sentence was true of the subset, the distinguished subset on the sentence. So here, the implicit question is, what's in the field, a closed field? I don't know the name, un champ. So if you have to check whether the cow and the dog or the rabbit or the hen is in the field, the answer is yes. You agree with me? While if I say the cow and the dog or the rabbit and the hen, the answer is false. So that was the task of the subject. It was a difficult task, but some people perform it 100% with this. And then we obtain maps for each subject, for each of the conditions, and we show that it was indeed possible to classify and distinguish between the different types of trees. We submitted the paper. You cannot read it. I don't know if you can see the picture. Me fully prepared for peer review, and this is the first comment from reviewer 2. Actually, the 2 reviewers, they ejected us because they say, oh, but it's obvious you are decoding the acoustics or the prosody. So why do you say it's syntax? Another one say, oh, it's not syntax, it's logic anyway. So this has nothing to do with syntax. And I could not really reply to that. There is a confound between prosody and syntax, but that's the way it is. That's the way it is realized in the signal. So this remained unpublished. It is somewhere on the internet. It's accessible, but we didn't publish this paper in a journal. This happens. But I like to mention it because it was one very early decoding study. Now, as I mentioned, there is one question is, are syntactic trees computed systematically when you listen to a sentence, or do you need to do a task? So we ran a sentence with Shotiga Patamadilok, who was a postdoc here in 2015. And we put people in the scanner and they read sentences of 2 types, either simple sentences, adjunct, or complex sentences. By complex, I mean sentences with an embedded clause in the middle, like the kids who exhausted, their parents slept. So this is a complex sentence. And a simple sentence would be, even if the kids spoke loudly, their parents slept. So their task was to read this sentence, but after the sentence, they were presented with a probe, just the kid slept, for example, and they had to say yes or no, given what they have just heard. So even if the kid spoke loudly, their parents slept, if you see the kid slept, the answer is no. If you read the parents slept, the answer is yes. And if the probe is totally unrelated to the sentence, you also say no, it's unrelated. Okay, so that's the task of the subjects in the scanner. And ephemera is not the best tool for that. We might have used MEG or EEG because what we wanted is to separate the response between the sentence and the probe. Okay, but it's still possible with ephemera because they happen a few seconds away, and we could run a model with a response for the sentence and a response for the probe and compare the activation to the 2 types of sentences or to the types of probes given the previous sentences. And what we found is that there was absolutely no difference in the brain between the 2 types of sentences. It's only when you had to do the task on the probe that you clearly see more activation for complex syntax than for simple syntax. Okay? And also in the case where the probe was unrelated, there was absolutely no difference between the 2 sentences or between the 2 probes. I'm not sure if I'm clear, but you see, the idea is you listen to a sentence. The idea is that you don't compute all the relations between all the words in the sentence. It's only if I ask you a question about the sentence that you kind of go back to it. Then you compute the relations and you do the task. Okay? So this fits with the view that you only compute some syntactic properties like the long distance dependency only if you need it, because maybe it's difficult. So that's one interpretation, at least, of this. And we haven't seen many brains yet. You see that we find Broca's area basically involved and the posterior STS, which are and you will see later the typical locations that you discover when you are looking for syntactic effects in the brain. Okay, around the same time, actually a little bit earlier, we said, okay, this syntactic tree business is nice, but can we go a little bit before that? The operation that creates trees is the operation of taking basically either two words or one word and a group of words and putting them together. This is called merging things together. And we say, okay, let's try to search for regions that put words together, binary words together. So a very naive approach would say, okay, let's present stimuli like the girl, the nice little girl to subjects and see where activation increases. Of course, I think nobody in this room would run such a stupid experiment because just the fact that there is more energy, the stimulus is longer, there is going to be increase of activations everywhere in the brain. Okay. So what we did, was to use stimuli that had the constant length, always 12 words, but the stimuli differed in how large were the constituents, that is the group of words that you could merge together. So we had either a full sentence of 12 words, like I believe that you should accept the proposal of your new associate, or a pure list of words, think, very, tree, where, of, watching, copy, tense, the stat. So these are the extreme cases, but we had intermediate cases where we took from a large corpus of sentences, groups of 4 words, like mayor of the city, he hates this color, they rate their names, here there are even 2 sentences, and we put them together. So the stimuli always have 12 words, okay? But sometimes you can integrate, the domain of integration of the groups of words becomes larger and larger when you go from condition C01 to C12, okay? Is that clear? In addition to that, in italic here, we added stimuli where we replaced all the meaningful words by meaningless words. By meaningful, I mean non-verbs, adjectives, adverbs. And we kept the grammatical words that have a bit of meaning too, like I, that, you. So I to see that you should begeb the tropufol of you to viroflate. With these few other words, you don't know what this sentence means, but it's still legal. You can have a feeling that it is legal in English and it forms a full sentence. If I say tong, very, gris, wear, of, vorting, nappy, I have a list of pseudo words mixed with grammatical words. Okay? So our idea is if there are brain regions that integrate words together to create these trees, there should be more activity when you have longer domains. Okay? So, and that's what we search for. The analysis consisted in trying to locate regions where activity increases with the size of the coherence, if you like. And first, when we took the real world conditions, we found that actually in the large part of the language network, that is the inferior frontal gyrus, Broca's area in short, and all along the temporal, superior temporal sulcus, there was an increase in activity when you can integrate more. And then when we went for the stimuli with pseudo words, which are also called Jabberwocky, according to the famous poem by Lewis Carroll, who used this type of pseudo words, we found that only a subset of these regions, that is the PSTS and Broca's area, again, show an increase with constituent size. And the regions in yellow here are regions where there was an effect for real words, but not for Jabberwocky, suggesting that they are integrated semantic properties rather than purely syntactic properties. You follow me? Okay. Now, this is all well and good, but more and more in the field of neurolinguistic, many people, including myself, were a bit, tired of using crazy stimuli like these ones, okay? Like putting together these things you never see in real life, right? So what are you doing when I give you something that is really unnatural? We don't know. For example, the brain could be trying to repair and invent, give a meaning to something which is not acceptable. And actually, I remember I see Stan is here in the room. And before we run this experiment, I told Stan, this is useless, this experiment, because I can tell you the result. The result is that people are going to make more effort to try to build a meaning for the intermediate cases. Here it's easy, so they will have not much activation, and here they can do nothing, there will be no activation. So my prediction was there would be an inverted U-curve shaped response in the brain, and Stan said, let's still do the experiment. And he was right, I didn't find so much the U-shaped curve, I found the pattern I have here, that is an increase of activity. So listen to your colleagues. But still the stimuli are a bit weird, and we know people are doing crazy things with crazy stimuli, and more in neurolinguistic, people like me and others became interested in using natural stimuli. I mean, in the end, we want to know what happens in your brain when you process real language, not crazy stimuli. So I embarked with colleagues in the US, John L. and Jonathan Brennan, on a project that some of you, I'm sure, I've already presented it, so you know about it. It's called the Little Prince Project, because the project consists in scanning people listening to the full audiobook of the Little Prince. So each individual listened to 1 hour and a half approximately, or read recently the full book. That's 15,000 words. And this is what we call natural language. Of course, it's a bit literary. It's not like everyday language, but still, actually, when you look at the Little Prince, it's not that literary. The vocabulary, except for a few exceptions, like allumeur de réverbère, which is a bit dated. Otherwise, the language is simple. So, you know, it's also read to children. They probably don't understand all the philosophical aspects of the book, but it's not high-level literature. So we scanned English, Mandarin Chinese, and French speakers listening to the entire audiobook using fMRI. And when we submitted the project, we say we are going to use computational linguistic model to generate predictors. And at the time, the project, we submitted it in 2016, 17, it was syntax. So we had computational model of syntax, a little bit like the ones I showed you at the beginning. And this model, they would tell you when in a sentence you need to do more computation to process the syntax. So we said, okay, we are going to search for brain areas where the activation correlates with the local complexity of computations in this algorithm. And when we did that, so with the English dataset, the first that we obtained, so the idea again is if you take a, where is my mouse? Oh, and I don't have a laser. Okay, you see the little tree there. You may not see the details, but on the bottom of the tree, you have the number of operations an algorithm building the tree must perform. And basically, that's what we did. We took the Little Prince, and for each word, we computed how many operations a parser has to do, and we correlated brain activation with these numbers. And we found a lot of things, much more than I would have expected, considering previous work on syntax. So we go way beyond just the posterior STS, which actually on the left we don't see. It's too bad I don't have a pointer. Okay, that's fine. But you have a large part of the language network. It's very bilateral. Actually, you have more stuff happening on the right, which was a little bit surprising for us. Then again, you may not know that, but most of prosody is processed in the right temporal hemisphere, and it correlates with syntax. So maybe some activations you see on the right are due to prosody. But that's the result. It's a fact. It surprised us a bit. But immediately what I told my colleagues is, you know, we are just putting a model with syntactic complexity, but we are not giving any semantic features. So, for example, you have more operations to do when you reach a noun, because English is a language where in a group, in a noun phrase, you typically have small grammatical words at the beginning and a noun word at the end, right? So the number of operations that you have to do also correlates with some semantic aspects, being a noun versus being a grammatical word. So this is, for me, not at all a pure syntactic effect. And because we only had syntactic predictors, we may have confound problems. That's my interpretation of why we see more. So with the models we had at the time, we couldn't really go much further. I played with this data set, and one thing I did is I uncrafted a few semantic categories. So I told you there are 15,000 words, and maybe about 260 of them were actually names of locations or 300 of them were names of numbers. And I just put a marker for these words and look whether the activations, especially at these words, where it increased relative to the average of all other words in the Little Prince. And I was pleased to see that you find activations here in the hippocampus, if I'm correct. I thought we had one with the PPA. Looks more like the hippocampus here. But we could kind of interpret the maps we were getting. For example, for the numbers, we have the intraparietal sulcus, which has already been identified as related to number and quantities. So these are results from other experiments using classic paradigm, looking at the effects of places or the effects of numbers. But I could do this only for a few semantic categories for which I had enough items. Okay, so this is just playing with the data. This is not published. It's just to say, oh, it's interesting. When people listen to natural text, when they are told about a location, they activate locations area in the brain beyond the classic language network. And then we realized at that time already that we could use computational models for meaning, for encoding the meaning of words, to try and do the same thing, but at a much larger scale, to do it for every word. So I need to tell you how it works. So words that have similar meanings occur in similar contexts. If imagine you read a text about cats, it's nearly probably possible to replace each occurrence of the word cat by dog, and it will more or less work. At least it will work better than if you replace it by car. Okay? So they are computational methods. You take huge text corpora, and for each word, you take the neighboring words, and you find ways of representing the neighboring words of a given word. Okay, this is called distributional semantics, and you find ways. In the end, you put for each word, you consider it as a vector in a space with many dimensions, and so each word is associated to a vector. It's like a dictionary, except that the definition of the word is a numerical vector, and the distances between the vectors reflect how similar are the neighborhoods in which these words are represented. And it has been shown that this encodes the meaning of words pretty well. That is, you find words with similar meaning having similar vectors. So what we did is we took one such existing model called GLOVE. For each word, it associates a vector with 300 dimensions. And we used these vectors. So for each word in the Little Prince, we replace each word by these vectors of 300 dimensions. And we looked whether these features correlated with brain activation. I'm not going to describe the whole pipeline process here, but imagine that you have just forget about 300 dimensions, take just one dimension. So the text of the Little Prince, it becomes a time series with the value of this feature for each word. So it's a kind of time series aligned temporally to the words. You can transform it into a fMRI signal, and you can theoretical fMRI signal, and you can correlate it with brain activation. One thing I would say is that we are using cross-validation. So we are not just looking directly at correlation. We are using a cross-validation scheme. And when you do that, and I was a bit surprised by that, you find that so this is using GLOVE. This is just a kind of stupid dictionary associating words to fixed vectors. So it's not taking context into account. But still, nearly all brain areas showed some significant correlation between GLOVE and the activation going on there. Okay, for me, it was one of the first surprises. It was not totally a surprise because there was a paper published in 2016 in Nature by Huff and Gallant that had shown that. But when I saw their paper, I saw, well, they show the whole brain. This is not what you are used to when we look at language activation. So it's a little bit weird. And as soon as I could do it, I run it on my data and I see something very similar to what they reported. So I think it was exciting. So GLOVE is a simple dictionary, not taking into the context into account. But as you may know, because you all know about ChatGPT, there are more powerful, much more powerful models of language that compute the meaning of words or meaning of sentences, taking the context into account. And this is what ChatGPT does. So at that time we didn't have ChatGPT, but we already had GPT-2 and long short-term memory for those who know, and BERT, which is yet another model. And so we took the models that were on the market to see if there were some differences in these models in their ability to predict brain activation. And Glove already found activation everywhere in the brain. It just somehow improved when you go to LSTM, GPT-2 and BERT. And models that are the best. So BERT is better than GPT-2, which is better than LSTM, which is better than Glove to do some NLP task, natural language processing task of engineering. And the models that have the best performance in engineering tasks, they also predict the fMRI signal better. But also they are trained on more data. So it's not really a fair comparison. And one of the things we did with Alexandre Pasquiou when he arrived here was to train ourselves these different models with exactly the same data set to have a more fair comparison. And that's the result we obtained. So what you have here are different models or different versions of the same model. So Glove is the one I mentioned before, LSTM 1, 2, or 4 layers, GPT 1, 2, 4, BERT 1, 2, 4 layers. So not only they were trained on the same data set, but they also had the same number of units to make a fair comparison. Here is the R score. So what you see is that the best, so these are computed on 50 subjects. This is the average of R score across subjects of the prediction. You get a correlation that is 0.2. For those who know correlations, 0.2, you can hardly see it with your eyes. So this is something that has always stressed me, but this is group result. When you look at individual results, we get to 0.5 in the best areas, like in the auditory areas. Also, what we know is that everybody listened to the same text, but the brain activation of different people is not exactly the same, right? So we could also compare without any model directly the activations of different people. And we know that the correlations we get between the model and people is about, on average, half of what we get when we forget the model and we do the direct activations between people. That is, the model explains about 50, on average, 50%. In some regions, it would explain 80% of the explainable signal, in others, 20%. Look, here I compare trained model with untrained model. What is an untrained model? It's a model that has not learned from a corpus. So basically it has random weights. So we were surprised when we realized that untrained model, they do much better than chance. So chance is here. Now we'll explain how we compute chance. But how is it that a model, especially Glove, random Glove means you associate totally random vector to each word, then you run your pipeline and you find significant predictions. It took us months to understand why. And I see the thing is totally, when I think about it now, it's totally silly, is that even though we are using cross-validation, it means that we are using different runs of fMRI, that is different chapters of the little print. So we train the model on the first chapter, tested on the last chapter, and then turn. The same words, the same grammatical words, you cannot avoid it. They are both in the training and in the test set. Okay, so if you take the pronoun, they appear both, and there is no way you cannot avoid it. You would have to craft your stimuli very selectively to avoid this overlap. And the linear regression scheme that we use between brain activation and the random vectors, it learned something. It learned to associate these arbitrary patterns between the brain activation pattern enough to be able to predict the next time you hear the same word. Okay, so that's why untrained models do much better than chance. And so to compute chance, you must not simply replace the weights of your model by random things. What you must do is change this at every occurrence of a given word. So I have a different random vector for the first occurrence of the word the, and a different random vector for the second occurrence. And when you do that, you find no significant effect. That's what a real random at the token level model does. So we learned this while, and I remember it took us time. So fortunately, trained model do better than untrained model, but if you see the increase is not crazy. Huh? What you can do, so the increases are here. I'm sorry that you cannot read these things. We increase on average of about 4%. The R values, which is not a lot. If there are some machine learning guys in the room, they must say. But you can do interesting things. You can look at where in the brain training does improve the activations, the predictability of activation. And for example, if you look at the LSTM models, I found it interesting that it doesn't improve the fit in the core language network, which is Broca's area here and the STS. It improves the fit more in higher level regions. What you can also do, you may know these models are deep learning models. So here it's not the ones I showed before, but we use GPT-2 and BERT with 12 layers. So they are basically feed-forward multi-layer models. And you can take the activation specific to one layer and try to predict the signal. And what we had hoped would be to see that some layers will correlate more with some brain regions than others. Okay, like it has been shown in vision for convolutional neural network. Unfortunately, we didn't find that. We found, so this is the layer, and this is how well you predict activation in different, in a parcellation of the brain. And you see that all the curves are more or less parallel. I simplify here. But we don't see clear interactions with brain regions correlating, say, with early layers and other brain regions correlating with later layers. So this means that there is not a mapping between the architectures of this model in terms of layers and the brain areas. We also, for those who know transformers, which are GPT-2 and BERT, we use at heads of attention, and we also correlated across layers, the activation in different heads of attention, and we didn't find any mapping between heads of attention and the brain. I should finish. So this is all fun, but you don't learn much about the implementation of language processing in the brain, except that you see that you can predict a little bit everywhere. So what we did with Alexandre and also Yair Lacretz and Bertrand Thirion was to say, oh, maybe we could use these models to try and locate how different brain regions process different type of information. And I come back to syntax versus semantics. And the way we did it is we trained the models like GPT, but given them impoverished corpora. So if you take ChatGPT, it has been trained on the web and books. So we took books actually, and we destroyed either syntax or semantic. So to destroy syntax, we removed all the grammatical words. To destroy semantics, we replaced each word by their syntactic category. So each noun was replaced by the fact that it was a noun, plural, singular, or stuff like that, but we removed the actual noun. So we created, so we have the original dataset called integral. We had the semantic dataset from which we remove the syntactic properties, and we have the syntactic dataset from which we remove the semantic properties. And then we took GPT-2 and GLOVE. We trained them to produce embeddings and computed the time courses for the text of the Little Prince, which starts when I was 6 years old, and so on. Okay? You see the logic of it? And then we looked where this model could still fit the data. So if I take, so in columns you have GLOVE. Again, this is just a dictionary, not taking into account the context. And GPT-2 is a model that takes into account the context. And you train it on syntax, and you look where it can still predict activation. You no longer have the full brain, but you still have a lot more than we would have expected from classic studies of syntax. And for semantic, we have even a little bit more. There is a debate in neurolinguistic between several neurolinguists of whether the same areas are processing syntax and semantic. And if you look at this map, you would say, okay, it looks pretty similar, maybe a bit widespread here. But if you look more closely and focus on the peaks of activation, you don't see my mouse, so I'm moving my mouse on these pictures. I'm really sorry, I don't have the pointer. If you look at the last row, we are trying we are showing in red the top regions for syntax, and in green the top regions for semantic. That is where you have the highest scores from model trained on semantic dataset. And in yellow you have the areas of overlap between the two. And you can see, for example, here, especially in the left hemisphere, that the peaks are not located in the same place. Okay, so that's a way to just look where you are best explained by syntax or semantics. And another way to represent this information is, for each voxel in the brain, compute the ratio between the correlations, the predictions for semantic and syntax. And when you do that, you see that some areas are more red, some areas are more green. So meaning that they are even more sensitive to syntax and, or to semantics. Another thing you can do, but I should finish now, is that you can play with your model to show really remove the effect of syntax from semantics, because there are still correlation between the syntactic predictors and semantic predictors, but you can use regression to remove the effect and get the pure effect of syntax and pure effect of semantic. And I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that effect of semantics when you remove syntax remains all over the brain, while effect of syntax when you remove semantic remains in the core language network. And also, one last thing I want to show you is that here you have the comparison between a model trained on normal language versus the sum of model trained on semantic and syntax, the way we defined it. And we find that for GLOVE, there is no difference between the two models, but when you use GPT-2, the model that was trained on a natural text does much better when it has both type of information. And what this reflects is a synergy between syntactic and semantic information. So the fact that having both information at the same time, you do much better than just the sum of having the information independently. So what have we learned across this journey? We have learned that language processing engages most of the brain rather than just the core language network that we identified previously. The very first slide I showed you when we compared intelligible speech versus non-intelligible speech. So that was subtraction. And now when we look at the brain, we believe that nearly the whole brain is used for language processing, which doesn't mean that if you destroy some part of the brain, that are not in the core language network, you cannot still do language. Does the brain systematically compute full syntactic structure? Probably not, because what I showed you before. We also found that in the core language network, all regions are sensitive to both syntactic and semantic, but the relative sensitivity varies. And we have to keep in mind that these are group results with 50 people. So there is a lot of blurring, both temporal and spatial, because of fMRI. So to really solve this question, we'll have to go back to individual analysis. So I don't want to claim, it's a strong claim, but this is based maybe on the tool that we are using. And finally, so I didn't tell you much about the linguistic knowledge in transformers, but we know that they don't have exactly the same knowledge of English, if they are trained on English, than humans, because we can create sentences that transformers are very happy with, but no English speaker would be happy with. So the thing is, every time we discover this type of sentences, the people who train these networks, they train them to correct the bugs. So for the last 3 years, it's always been like that. So linguists come and they say, oh, look, the ChatGPT does not handle correctly these sentences. Well, they change their training set to train it to handle these sentences. So in the limit, it's converging to human behavior, but it's not there yet. You can still see in the behavior of ChatGPT, not in his production, but in his understanding of sentences, that he does things that humans don't do. But even if that's the case, what I wanted to show you is that you can train them on specific data set to extract certain type of information and try to, by correlating with brain activation, identify which brain regions are processing this type of information. And I'm going to stop here with pictures of all the people who were involved in this 15 years of work. It's not the only thing I did, but it was my main research. I stop here.